are meant to open up the biblical scholarship for the wider church so people can see what careful exegesis looks like and to experience how slowing down with the text can really open up the meaning that has been there all along, but that we just have not had the eyes to see. So today we're going to be looking at the superscriptions of two Psalms. Superscriptions are not normally where one looks for something inspirational, but Ryan has done some work that shows that if you understand what's happening in the superscription, it reveals how the scripture writers are wrestling with history and are seeking to understand what is God doing, are both taking what they see and wrestling with God and then creating something new. And the very process of how scripture was actually written starts to come alive a little bit with these superscriptions. So as we go through this, we simply want to model slow, attentive, reflective reading with all the skills of exegesis. So we're not trying to learn a specific technique or any jargon, but just listen to the text. So as of now, we are a small enough group that if you have questions, feel free to just put them in the chat and we can interact as seems best. I don't think we need to have anything formal there. But after Ryan speaks, we will have a time for simply general discussion. And I hope we're able to really engage. So with that, I'm going to turn everything over to Ryan, unless you need anything else from me, Ryan.
No, thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you everyone for being here. It's good to see some of you again from last time and some new faces as well. A number of you mentioned in your introductions that you were doing more, maybe more academic work. So for those of you who are interested, I've put a file in the chat where you can find an article that I've recently drafted. It's not yet been reviewed or accepted. This is just the draft. So if you're interested in some of the more academic details of what I'm going to present today, you'll find them there in that draft. And so let me share my screen. Okay. Can you see the slides?
Looks
Perfect.
good.
Okay, the two titles of Psalm 88. A clue to the mystery of the Psalter. St. Augustine described the arrangement or the order of the Psalms as a great mystery. So this is at the beginning of his commentary on Psalm 150. He says, "The arrangement of the Psalms, which seems to me to contain the secret of a great mystery, has not yet been revealed to me." Modern Psalm scholarship, especially over the last 50 years, has been working hard to solve this mystery of the Psalter's arrangement. Some scholars have argued that the Psalms are arranged to tell a story, and different stories have been proposed. Uh, and they've argued that we should read each individual psalm, not just by itself, but in the context of the book of Psalms, and especially in light of the surrounding psalms. But then other scholars have argued that no, the Psalter is more like an anthology. It's like a loose collection of poems. And the way that we read one psalm was probably never meant to shape the way we read the psalms around it. So in this short presentation, we're not going to solve the mystery of the Psalter's arrangement. I'm in the same boat as Augustine. It has not yet been revealed to me. But I would like to draw our attention to one overlooked clue that might shed some light on the mystery and help us become better readers of the Psalter. The clue is found in Psalm 88. Psalm 88 is the only psalm in the Psalter that has two titles or two superscriptions. The first one says a song, a psalm of the Korahites. But then there's a second title that says to the leader, and I'm reading from the NRSV, according to Machalat La'anot, a maskil of Heman the Ezrahite. So we have one psalm with two titles, and they seem to give conflicting information. So the first title says it's a song, a psalm. The second one says it's a maskil. The first one says that it's by the Korahites. The second one says that it's by Haman the Ezrahite. So what's going on here? Why are there two different titles? The solution, I think, is actually found not in Psalm 88, but in the next psalm, in Psalm 89. And it was in my study of Psalm 89 for our scriptural work that I discovered what I'm about to show you now. So we'll come back to the two titles of Psalm 88 and to the mystery of the Psalter. But for now, we'll look at Psalm 89. And in case you haven't noticed, the presentation is organized as a chiasm. So we'll begin and end by talking about the mystery of the Psalter. Working inwards, we'll talk about the title of Psalm 28. And then at the very center, which is where we'll spend most of our time, we'll talk about Psalm 89, because it was really my study of Psalm 89 that prompted these questions and led to some of these discoveries. So let's look now at the center, Psalm 89. Psalm 89 begins with a short two-part introduction. It's a long psalm, 53 verses, but it has an introduction, verses 2 to 3. In these verses, the psalmist speaks and he praises God for his unending loyalty. And then in verses 4 to 5, the second half of the introduction, God speaks and he talks about his unending covenant with David. And then the word Selah marks the end of the introduction. Then you have the main body of Psalm 89, and it follows the same two-part structure as the introduction. So in verses 6 through 19, the psalmist speaks and he praises God. And then in verses 20 to 38, God speaks about his covenant with David. And then again, these verses end with Selah. So there's a kind of A B structure that unites the first 38 verses of Psalm 89. And together, these first 38 verses are a confident and joyful celebration of God's unending covenant with David. The opening line really summarizes the tone of these first 38 verses. I will sing of the Lord's acts of loyalty forever. But then, if you've read the psalm, you know that in verse 39, there's a sharp turn. And verse 39 begins, but now you have spurned and rejected. And then the rest of the psalm, verses 39 to 52. And by the way, I'm using Hebrew numbering, so in the English it's one off. This would be 38, I think, and following. In Hebrew, verses 39 to 52, this last part of the psalm is now a dejected accusation against God for going back on his covenant promises, followed by a plea for him to remember and have pity on his people. So, in contrast to the first 38 verses, the tone of this section, verses 39 to 52 and 53, the tone of this section is summarized by what the psalmist says, I think it's verse 50, where are your former acts of loyalty? Now, this dramatic shift in the tone, together with different poetic patterns, led me to conclude that verses 39 to 53 were actually added to Psalm 89 sometime after the first 38 verses were written. So, in other words, I concluded that someone wrote Psalm 89, 1 to 38, and then at a later point in time, someone or some group of people added verses 39 to 53 to the original poem. And again, if you're interested in the details about this argument, there's the article in the chat. In the meantime, let's take a closer look now at what I see as the addition to Psalm 89. The addition, this is verses 39 to 53, English 38 to 52, I think. It has three main parts. The first part, the text is up here. It's an accusation against God for not keeping his covenant promises. You have done this, you have done that, you have done this, etc. And it ends with Selah. Then the second part, verses 47 through 49, begins with a question, how long? Followed by a plea for God to remember. And then this part also ends with Selah. The third part also begins with a question, where, again, followed by a plea to remember. And then there's a concluding blessing in verse 53. This is the addition to Psalm 89. This is how it's structured. One thing that caught my attention was how these additional verses repeat key words and key themes from the first 38 verses of Psalm 89. So, for example, the words covenant, servant, defiled, laid, exalted, right hand, foes, enemies, throne, ground, created, swore, loyalty, David, all these words are key words in the first 38 verses of Psalm 89. And now, here in the addition, they're repeated. But now there's an ironic twist because according to the first 38 verses, a celebration of God's covenant with David, God was supposed to keep his covenant forever. Instead, now in the addition, it says, you've renounced your covenant. You were supposed to exalt David and place David's right hand over his enemies, but instead you've exalted the right hand of his enemies, and so on. So there's all kinds of repetitions with an ironic twist. And it seems like these additional verses were written, they weren't just randomly tacked on, they were actually written in response to, in conscious reflection on, and in response to the original poem. You said you would do this, but instead, you've done the opposite. So whoever added these additional verses to Psalm 89, they did so as a conscious reflection on and response to the original poem, the first 38 verses. But then there was something else that caught my attention. The addition to Psalm 89, or these last 39 to 53, this addition also has really strong connections to Psalm 88. So, for example, the word spurned, which is the first verb in this additional section, it's a rather distinctive verb and it also occurs in Psalm 88. The verb hide also occurs in Psalm 88. Will you hide yourself? Um, the phrase your wrath also occurs in Psalm 88. And actually, these are the only two places in the whole Psalter where this exact form, the exact form of this word occurs. Other words that occur in Psalm 88 include remember, live, death, soul, Sheol, faithfulness, and there are others. These connections to Psalm 88 cluster, especially in the middle of this edition, in verses 47 to 49. And then, along with all of these word repetitions, there's also a general similarity in theme and in emotion between Psalm 88 and this addition in Psalm 89, especially the middle part of the addition, verses 47 to 49. So, for example, the themes of death and mortality, which feature here in the addition, are also key themes in Psalm 88. So, what do we make of these connections, not only to Psalm 89, but also to Psalm 88? And I would suggest that these additional verses at the end of Psalm 89, so verses 39 to 53, were written as a response not to Psalm 89 individually, but to Psalms 88 and 89 as a unit. In other words, someone combined Psalm 88 and Psalm 89, the first 38 verses of Psalm 89. They combined them and then they added these extra verses as a conclusion or a response to the whole, to the combined unit. Now, if this is right, then it explains why Psalm 88 has two titles. The first title, a song, a psalm of the Korahites, it doesn't belong to Psalm 88 individually, but to Psalms 88 and 89 as a combined unit. In other words, the Korahites combined Psalm 88 with Psalm 89, 1 to 38, and then they added the additional verses at the end as a conclusion or response to the whole. And then they put this title at the top of the new composite work. They called it a song, a psalm of the Korahites. So, according to the superscriptions, Haman the Ezrahite wrote Psalm 88. Then Ethan the Ezrahite wrote Psalm 89, 1 through 38. And then the Korahites combined these two poems and added a conclusion or a response. And then the title at the top of the whole, this a song, a psalm of the Korahites, is an explicit trace of their editorial work. Now, what would this mean for how we interpret these two psalms, Psalms 88 and 89? And unfortunately, there's not enough time here in this session to explore that question, and I honestly haven't had time to explore it fully myself. But one immediate thought is that if we were to read Psalm 88 and 89 together, not as separate poems, but as a unified poem, with the last part of 89 as a conclusion to the whole, one thing it might mean is that the suffering individual in Psalm 88 is to be identified as the king, the suffering king of Psalm 89. So the conclusion that the Korahites added to these Psalms, 89, 39 to 53, is all about the suffering of the king. It says the days of his youth have been cut short. God's wrath is being poured out on him. He's being taunted by his enemies. This is a lot like the picture of the suffering individual in Psalm 88. He says, for example, wretched and close to death, from my youth up, I suffer your terrors, I'm desperate. Your wrath has swept over me, your dread assaults destroy me. It seems likely to me that the Korahites, who put Psalms 88 and 89 together and then added the conclusion, understood and wanted us to understand the suffering individual in Psalm 88 as the suffering king in Psalm 89. And this is just one potential example of how the literary, editorial context of Psalm 88 can change the way you see its message. So now back to the mystery of the Psalter's arrangement. If what I've argued about Psalms 88 and 89 is correct, then this could have implications for how we read and interpret all of the Psalms. The double title in Psalm 88 would be the most explicit case in the book of Psalms where you have two Psalms that are combined and considered a single poem. It's explicit because they actually have a title over the unity. So the two Psalms they retain their individual integrity. They both keep their own titles. Psalm 88 has a title, Psalm 89 1 to 38 has a title. But at the same time, in addition to retaining their individual integrity, they come together to form parts of a larger whole, which then gets its own title, a song, a psalm by the Korahites. This uniquely explicit example of editorial intent could be a clue for how we should read the rest of the Psalter, for how we should read other pairs of psalms or groups of psalms that have strong connections to one another, even if they don't have a shared superscription like in this unique case. So, for example, Psalms 1 and 2, they don't have superscriptions, but they're a lot like Psalms 88 and 89 in that they share similar vocabulary and they share some similar themes. What would it look like to read Psalms 1 to 2 both as individual poems and as a unified poem? And many people have done this. The same is true for Psalms 3 and 4. There's lots of repetitions across these two Psalms. There's some similar language, some similar themes. What would it look like to read them not just as individual poems, but as a unified poem? And there are many other examples in the book of Psalms. So this doesn't solve the mystery of the Psalter's arrangement, but it might put us on a good track for doing so. At the very least, it opens up new possibilities for us when we read the Psalms. So next time you read a psalm, I would encourage you to think about how it might relate to the other psalms around it. What connections do you see? And how might these shape the way you understand the psalm's meaning? That's all I have for this presentation, and we have time now, I think, for discussion. So, Elizabeth, if you'll
Thank you very much, Ryan. Well, that is the presentation. Now is time. You are welcome to jump in and ask any question you like. And the threat is, if you don't, I will.
May I ask a question?
Please.
Yes, the I'm fascinated with this, Ryan. I think you're really onto something. I've noticed the same dynamic happening in Psalms 38 and 39.
Hmm.
And it's almost the same themes too, but specifically it's described to the Psalm of David, Psalm 38 being a really difficult psalm. I call it nobody's favorite psalm. Um, and then 39 gets even worse. I mean, he's asking God to leave him alone. Please, would you please leave me alone? Because every time he got close to me, um, it looks to me in Psalm 38 that it's specifically then that the psalmist is saying that these bad things that are happening to him are as a result of his own sin. That's what it looks like to me. And I'm wondering if that's the way that you take Psalm 88 as well. Is it Haman? Is that I'm from I'm wondering especially about the term wrath, the Hema, there is the wrath of God. Why is your wrath upon me? Um, that's what we say in English, but in Hema is just heat. In Arabic, is heat. Same thing. Why are you hot on my trailer? Uh, do you see in Psalm 88 as the individual lament? Is that as a result of their personal sin that God is breathing down their neck and he feels such an isolation? Uh, or is this more of a generic, I'm suffering and it just seems like you have it in for me, God, even though I haven't done anything particularly wrong? Like in many other Psalms, you said, I've done everything right, but you're still leaning on me. How do you read that, Ryan?
Yeah, great question. And I'll actually, Elizabeth, if it's okay, defer to you since um, I didn't do our scriptural work on 88. We had a guy named Eyal Nahum he did Psalm 88, but Elizabeth was part of that, and so she would know better how we interpreted that.
Well, we ended up, in fact, a lot of what Eyal did was a lot of exploratory questioning in terms of, am I suffering for my sake? Am I suffering for somebody else's sake? A lot of asking questions, but finding that specifically no answer was given. There was no satisfaction to be had from any of those questions, but all of the resolution came in what I kind of called the face-off between all the words for God's character, his righteousness, his faithfulness, and all the words for death, oblivion, Sheol. And in the kind of weighing of which one will I end up trusting? In the end, God's character wins out. And so the resolution is without having the answer to any question, God's character alone is sufficient for me to continue bringing my prayer each morning to Him. And the fear of death goes away, but all the anguish and suffering remains. And so there's a shift from I want to understand to I know all I need to know, and I'll accept even death because I trust in the character of this God. That's the flow that we ended up with.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you.
Well, it's also with 38 and 39. I'm one of the gears has been tasked with this worse than worse, Sam. Um, it's very much like 88, you're right. And there's kind of an ambiguity at the beginning where he says he's going to keep silent while the wicked are in his presence, and you wonder, well, why is that? Psalm 37 might give you the idea that it's because they're prosperous and I'm jealous of them, so I don't want to give them. It could be, don't let the fool say in his heart there is no God, and they're doing great, and I'm not going to talk in front of them because I don't want to sound jealous. I think 38 sheds the clue, though, being the closer Psalm in proximity, where verse 17 says, they think they're better than me. They think they're superior. And they're kind of making fun of me because I'm being afflicted in my discipline, but they're no better than me. So that really, just the one Psalm previous really helped me understand probably why the psalmist is keeping silence there, where there could be a number of reasons, but that one seems to best fit 39. So
Thank you.
Because both 38 and 88 have the same thing is that is affliction that is causing his companions, his closest companions, his own family to disown him. Um,
Thank you, Ed. We have time for one, maybe two more questions because we're having fun, so we're going a little bit long. If anybody else would like to ask anything.
Yeah, I would like to ask a question that regards one of the words in the double superscription to Psalm 88. And in the chat, I put PDFs of two articles that might be of interest on the whole question of superscriptions. One by Bruce Waltke, who has an interesting theory about how the superscripts are actually um, to be understood as a combination of superscripts and subscripts originally. It's a very interesting theory and one I happen to think has a lot of evidence in its favor. And another one by Nahum Sarna, which is virtually unknown, but is an incredibly well-researched article about superscripts, arguing that they're genuine, which is unusual, of course, in biblical scholarship. They're often put to one side and considered to be um, late additions, and probably some of them are, but in general, Sarna argues that they give us authentic information going back to the origins of the song. But the word is machalat, is how it's vocalized um, in Psalm 88 and also in Psalm 53. But since you're a Septuagint scholar, you might remember that in Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion, uh, that's translated as chorea, referring to dance. And what's interesting there, and this relates to the theory about superscript subscripts, is that Psalm 87 includes a reference to dance.
Hmm.
And so it's an argument, I think Walke makes it, I can't remember for sure, that that's an argument in favor of associating um, the first part of the superscript of Psalm 88 with Psalm 87 as a doublet, so to speak, with Psalm 87's superscript.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, John. I especially appreciate the article by Sarna because I didn't know about it. So thank you for sharing that. Kind of proves your point, I guess. The one by Waltke, I'm familiar with that one. I actually engage with it in the article because yeah, he takes this as one of his one. He takes this actually the double superscription 88 is actually a key piece of evidence for his theory on the. But anyways, yeah, I engage with that in the article if you're interested. I wasn't persuaded by his treatment of the 88 superscription. Um, I don't think it solves the problem. I think it just shifts the problem. Because then if you move now if you move the Shir Mizmor Libnei Korach, now 87 has a superscript and a postscript, and they're basically the same.
Yeah.
And he know how to explain that. He says, well, maybe multiple traditions. So I think his theory doesn't really, it still leaves a problem open for the double superscription.
Thank you all. I think we have just demonstrated that there's a lot of depth, and it really does make a difference how we end up taking it. It can change how we understand a complete portion of scripture. So thank you very much, Ryan. Thank you everybody for coming. If this has raised topics of interest, feel free to send them to us as recommendations for the next Going Deeper. And we also have fairly regular, nearly weekly reading groups where we tackle all kinds of things. And if somebody would like to be a little more in the thick of what we're doing week by week, feel free to contact us and see if we could have you join some of our reading groups. So with that, a great thank you for this session. This has been fascinating. All kinds of thoughts coming out of this. May this be one more step in our own journey of traveling into the depths of God's word so that we can make the kind of difference that he wants each one of us to make in our lives. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you. Blessings.
Blessings.
Thank you guys.
Bye.